Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to today's virtual discussion celebrating the recent publication of Benjamin Franklin, Swimmer, An Illustrated History, written by Dr. Sarah B. Pomeroy and published by the American Philosophical Society Press this spring. This book tells the story of APS founder Benjamin Franklin's lifelong delight and his influence in making swimming popular in the Western world. Swimming, as we will see, becomes a valuable lens for examining Franklin's life, times, and his strong, inventive personality. As we will touch on in today's conversation, Franklin's swimming was documented in a range of primary sources, from his letters to his famous autobiography. And I don't know about you, but I'm in 90-degree Philadelphia, so swimming seems like a really great topic for today. If you have not purchased a copy of the book yet, it is available for a 21% discount today for those who've registered for the talk. We're going to put that discount information in the chat. So please take advantage. It's a fantastic book, and you know you're going to want a copy. Before we begin our program, I want to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who've offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin, our subject for today, in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. A little housekeeping. We are using Zoom webinar today, so not to worry, you have all been muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button. You can find that now on the bottom of your navigation bar. You can type your question in at any time, and we're hoping to have a really good conversation at the end of the presentation today. So please submit a question at any point when you have it. Finally, we are offering closed captioning for this presentation. If you'd like to use it during the presentation, please locate the CC box on the bottom navigation bar. It should actually be to the right of the Q&A button. And go ahead and click it, and you will see a transcription of today's talk. So I think that's enough housekeeping. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sarah B. Pomeroy. She is Distinguished Professor of Classics and History Emerita at Hunter College and the Graduate School, CUNY. Dr. Pomeroy is widely recognized as a pioneer in the field of women's history and classical studies, known for not only using textual sources, but also artistic and archaeological evidence to reconstruct the past. This can be seen in her many books, from Goddesses, Whores, Wives, and Slaves, Women in Classical Antiquity, first published in 1974 and reissued in 1995, through many more books to Pythagorean Women, Their Lives and Their Writings, 2013, and as you'll see today, Benjamin Franklin, Swimmer. Dr. Pomeroy is the Lady Joan Reed Author-in-Residence at the Benjamin Franklin House, London, and a member of the American Philosophical Society, elected in 2014. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us today. So if you could bring up the first slide, Adriana. There you will see a copy of the cover of the book. Again, make sure you go ahead and order a copy. We're going to put that link in the chat. I find this a pretty striking cover, Sarah. I love the image of the swimmers on here. I wonder if you could tell us a little about this image. You know, where did you find it? Who created it? And if my eyes are right, are these swimmers naked? And why is that?
Yes, I found this drawing in a 16th century swimming manual. The original is a woodcut. The book designer added the color. Lycra hadn't been invented, and regular clothing would have dragged the swimmer down. Franklin's grandson, Benny Bache, describes swimming across the Seine and back while balancing his clothing on his head, like the swimmer on the cover who was supporting some fanciful birds. It wasn't easy, and Benny reports that his clothing did get wet. Certainly nudity was one of the reasons that women didn't swim, and Franklin talks only about boys and men swimming.
That's great. It's a beautiful image, and I love the color that they've put on there. Now, the APS has recently installed in our Jefferson Garden, and for those of you who've been to the APS campus, you know that we have this beautiful garden right to the left of Library Hall. They've installed a replica of a boat that was sort of designed, conceptualized by Franklin, but never built. And if I could have the next slide, we can see an image of that. So you see the gate there, and you see the boat behind. Now, there accompanying the boat is a panel by you reflecting on Franklin's relationship with water. And if you'll indulge me, and I realize that maybe not everyone at home can read it, I'll read the text for everyone. It says, Benjamin Franklin, the water American. For Benjamin Franklin, water was both a passion and a subject. He was the first to chart the Gulf Stream and investigated water pollution in Philadelphia. Water was also a source of pleasure for Franklin. In his autobiography, he wrote about his fascination with the sea, whether navigating it in boats or swimming through it. Franklin's youthful inventions included swimming paddles, like fins, and an early method of kite surfing. Franklin praised swimming for promoting health, hygiene, and safety. His advice about water safety and the importance of teaching everyone to swim remains relevant. Swimming has always been useful knowledge. And while his printing house comrades imbibed strong beer, Franklin, the water American, would insist on drinking water instead. And I really love how you've worked into this a reference to the APS's mission, of course, the promotion of useful knowledge. This is really such a nice overview of Franklin's relationship to the water. But I'm sure maybe it only skims the surface. What can you say about Franklin's relationship to water?
Well, there's a whole lot that one could say, but I was particularly interested in swimming. Franklin spent a lot of time traveling in ships, and he was observant, and he noticed small things like the calming effect oil has on waves when cooks throw it overboard. But as I said, I was particularly interested in his swimming because no one had studied this aspect of his life before, and because his grandson Benny also wrote about swimming.
So in this book, you take us through Franklin's entire life. And he lived in several different places over his life. Where was he swimming when he lived in these different communities?
Well, when he could afford it, he chose to rent lodging in homes that were near places where he could swim, especially rivers. And we know that he swam in the Thames and the Seine.
And I think we have an image in the next slide, if we could have that. What is this? Is this Chelsea, Sarah, that's up on the
Yeah, this is, and as Franklin described his famous swim from Chelsea to Blackfriars. He was so proud of it. He described it later in life in his autobiography. I'll read that section from my book on page 13.
That'd be great.
I stripped and leapt in the river and swam from Chelsea to Blackfriars, performing on the way many feats of activity, both upon and underwater, that surprised and pleased those to whom they were novelties. I had from a child been ever delighted with this exercise, had studied and practiced all Thévenot's motions and positions, added some of my own, aiming at the graceful and easy, as well as the useful. All these I took this occasion of exhibiting to the company and was much flattered by their admiration. We know that he was a show-off, right? Modesty was not one of his virtues.
I really feel you've captured Franklin in pulling out that quote. I think that's fantastic. So he's talking about swimming. How did he learn to swim? And given that so many early Americans lived on or near the water, near rivers, near harbors, was it common for people to learn how to swim in the 18th century?
Well, as was true of many of Franklin's skills, he was self-taught. And he swam as a boy in Boston with his friends. I live on Eastern Long Island, surrounded by water, and many of the men born here plan to become professional fishermen, yet some of them do not know how to swim, even nowadays. And every summer, visiting adults and children drown because their rented boats turn over, or they go into the ocean in places where there are no lifeguards and they don't know how to swim. So swimming is not so widely taught as it should be.
Right. Now, one of the things that's really wonderful about your book is that you remind us that swimming in the 18th century is different than in the 21st century, and in particular, the strokes that they did, right? Did Franklin have a favorite stroke? And maybe you could talk a little bit about, how he swam.
Goggles had been invented, but most people didn't use them. Franklin doesn't mention them. And so his favorite stroke was the breaststroke because you can keep your eyes dry and see where you're going. And in the rivers, you had to watch out, certainly.
Yes, it's good to know what you're swimming into, which I think maybe kind of leads to if we could maybe see the next slide. What in the 18th century was in the water? I live here in Philadelphia today, and I live near bodies of water that probably are not very good to swim in. Was the 18th century, was the water cleaner? What was in the water back then?
Well, if we go back to the other slide as well, we can see that in the water, there were always small boats, and there must have been plenty of debris from the fishermen and from their nets and so on. And when he was on an ocean voyage and it was very hot, Franklin wanted to swim, but he looked into the water and he saw that he would encounter sharks. So he changed his mind.
Yeah, a very good thing to avoid. There was a great passage too in your book about like wild reeds and stuff that would grow along the riverbanks, right? And the need to kind of make sure you don't get kind of wrapped up in those. Which feels a little different than the rivers in Philly today.
Yes, well, the rivers have, as you can see, I used, this is why I used archaeological and art historical evidence, because the rivers have been changed by human intervention. There are embankments now. You wouldn't find a sandy shore like you saw in the painting of Chelsea. The Seine has been narrowed and made deeper for larger ships, and there are dams now. So, but these 18th century paintings show you the water just as it was when Franklin swam.
Yeah, they're beautiful, beautiful illustrations. And it's one of the things I love about the book is all the color illustrations that you have in here of these great sites. It feels like you're getting back to Franklin's time with the images you've chosen. So Franklin teaches himself to swim. From the passage you read, he's a show-off. So does Franklin become a popular instructor? I get the sense from the book that he does, and that maybe more than one person really wanted him to teach them how to swim.
Yes, when he swam from Chelsea to Blackfriars, performing all those feats that you can read about in the swimming manuals, and then very difficult postures like swimming with, as you saw on the cover of the book, 2 arms up, but also swimming with your legs up, 1 leg up, 1 arm up, all kinds of postures like that. He had to be very strong to sustain those postures. And when he finished his swim, an aristocrat who had watched him swim from Chelsea to Blackfriars asked him if he would teach his sons how to swim. His sons were about to embark on a voyage to Europe. And then he tried to persuade Franklin to open a swim school, an American-style swim school in England. But Franklin had already made up his mind to go back to Philadelphia. And so he turned that down, but he remembers that in his autobiography.
And one could imagine in that Franklin both sees the opportunity to make some money, but also maybe the social connections, right, that come from sort of ingratiating himself with those above him.
Yeah, swimming cuts across all social classes.
a wonderful point. Now, we often think about Franklin the inventor, right? And can you tell us a little bit about some of the swim aids that Franklin invented?
I think that they were probably his first inventions. We need the next image.
Yep, next slide, please.
He boasted in old age about the swimming paddles he had invented as a boy. He remembered that he had tried them on both his hands and his feet, but they weren't flexible because they were made of wood, so he didn't continue to use them. They were shaped very much like the modern fins that we see in this photo. He also tried a method of surfing while holding a kite and found it worked beautifully.
I love that description. So if I can just ask, do you think he was sort of laying on his back and the kite was kind of pulling him across the water?
Yeah, he was like a little sailboat. He turned his body into a little sailboat.
He is, I mean, I never run out of amazement at his thinking and the way he can kind of invent new ways of doing things. And speaking of which, there's a really interesting story that you share in here about a hard-boiled egg as a technique in teaching swimming. Could you talk a little bit more about how an egg could be used in
This
swimming?
was much discussed after he published it. He advised the swimming instructor to throw a hard-boiled egg into the water, and the student was to retrieve the egg. The student would quickly understand that it was difficult to get to the bottom because the buoyancy of the water held him up. I tried something similar when my grandchildren were learning to swim. I threw brightly colored objects like these little rockets into the pool and asked the children to dive for them, and they did. So it was the same technique.
I think if I were learning, I would rather grab the thing that you have than accidentally grab the egg too hard.
And some dirty old boiled egg.
So Franklin he teaches himself to swim. He is demonstrating these different strokes and his proficiency. At one point in the book, you call him an evangelist for swimming. Talk a little bit more about that. Why is swimming, why is that what he's going to be an evangelist for?
Well, I call him an evangelist because I think it's no coincidence that soon after he left England and France, swimming manuals were published and swimming schools opened and swimming became more popular. And when he returned to Philadelphia, he advocated making swimming part of the standard educational curriculum. In fact, nowadays, most of the high schools and colleges with which I am familiar have pools, and some require students to demonstrate that they can swim 2 lengths before allowing them to graduate.
Yeah, I went to Williams College in Western Massachusetts, and we had a swimming requirement that was the bane of some of my friends who didn't grow up. So I grew up on the coast just south of Boston, so we knew how to swim from the start. But so we have up here. So I think this is one of the swimming manuals, right?
Yes.
So it feels like, Franklin is sort of, he's reading older texts, right? And he's also sort of doing and other people are then sort of quoting him, right? There's sort of a textual history of swimming.
Yes, and you can't say too much that's new. Although the boiled egg, the hard-boiled egg, that was something new. That was something much discussed.
I wonder if that was a marketing attempt on his point to make sure that people paid attention. Now, you've also noticed in your research and in this book that sometimes swimming wasn't necessarily good for everyone. And there's a really striking image. I wonder if I could have the next slide, please. And this comes from the sort of the witch hunting days. Now, talk a little bit about the relationship between swimming and the accused of being a witch. Were they fans of swimming?
Well, since antiquity, some thought the ability to swim had a magical quality. In Franklin's day, those accused of witchcraft were tested by seeing whether they sank or floated when ducked into the water. Those who sank were judged innocent, but of course they probably drowned. And those who floated were guilty and handed over to the authorities. So here you see a woman who is all trussed up, and I don't know how you could have swum in that position anyway, but the idea was to see if she floated or sank.
It's fascinating too that, Franklin's born, 13, 14 years after the end of the Salem witchcraft trials. So he still would have lived in a family that had memory, right,
Yes.
of the fear of witches. And now, one of the things that I really, really appreciate about this, both as a reader with, teenage nephews, but also as somebody who works in an archive, is your inclusion of Benjamin Franklin Bache, or Benny, his journal. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your decision to include Franklin's grandsons in a book about Franklin the swimmer.
Well, Franklin took his two grandsons with him to France. Benny Bache, the son of Franklin's daughter, Sally, kept a journal. It was in French, actually. In it, he describes several dramatic episodes of swimming in the Seine and flying a kite on the shore, just like Franklin used to do when he was a boy. Benny also records the routine accidental drownings of servants just on the shore. Benny's journal has never before been published, so I may do some more work on it someday.
We would very much welcome that. And you have a comment, a nice comment about, I think Benny is very relatable, right? There's that scene where they fly the kite ends up on the other side of the river. One of them decides to swim over, but they don't swim fast enough, and somebody's stolen the kite by the time they get to
Yes.
the other side. It's really wonderful. I mean, it's what, 250 years old, yet it's still, I think it's still a very relevant story.
Yes.
Vivid, yeah. This is, so I'd like to maybe pivot just to talk a little bit about the origins of this book, which you, in your introduction, attribute to two different events. And you attribute this book to your induction as a member of the APS in 2014, and then your invitation to be the Lady Joan Reed Author in Residence in Children's Literature at the Benjamin Franklin House. So how did those two opportunities sort of turn you on to Franklin the swimmer?
Well, coming to the meetings at the APS and watching that portrait of Franklin beaming down, I started to read about Franklin, and I read half sentences in passing about Franklin was a swimmer. And since I'm a swimmer and I like to read about swimming, I did some research. I tried to find out. So I read all the usual books about Benjamin Franklin, and some of them, I have to say, like, well, I better not say who. Some don't mention the swimming at all, and some just give it half a sentence. And so I realized that there might be something here to say, something that I'm interested in writing about. And it was wonderful doing this research and working in the APS library and using the digitized Franklin papers.
What is it? What was the experience of being the Lady Joan Reed Author in Residence? Did that give you? Was it an opportunity to spend some time in London and sort of?
I did spend some time, but then of course everything was shut down, so the residence part was not. Still, we did a number of Zoom events.
Oh, fantastic.
And what is the relationship between Franklin House and the APS? I'm not sure, but it seems very cordial. They were very helpful in London.
And if I remember properly, that is the only surviving building that Franklin resided in. And it's, of course, a beautiful space in London. And we at the APS, of course, want to do more events and coordinated work with them.
Yes, and if you go to Franklin House in London, you see that it's only a block and a half from the Seine, where Franklin could easily swim. And then it has very large windows where he took his famous air baths. where he sat naked in front of the windows, and he thought that was very healthy. Actually, he always had skin problems, so it probably was healthy to sit naked in the cool air and maybe get some sun on it.
I wonder if we have any accounts of what the neighbors thought, if they agreed. Now, you're a classicist, of course, by your kind of career's work, and you've spent most of your career thinking about a world more than 2,000 years old. Was it hard to sort of pivot from that sort of work into the 18th century? Are there ways in which researching the world of Franklin was either similar or different to the process of researching the ancient women of the ancient world?
Well, actually, there was one more book since my Women in the Ancient World. I did publish with the Getty a book on Maria Sibylla Merian, an 18th century entomologist and artist who went to Suriname and painted insects mostly, and some plants that Europeans had never seen before. So that actually was a book for young adults. And that's where we got this idea that I would be writing another book for young adults, maybe using the Benny Beish journal more than I actually did. But when I finished this book and I saw that it was all going to be original research and have some bibliography and so on, I realized this is an adult book. Of course, my young adult grandchildren have no problem reading it, but many adult books and young adult books just overlap. So it was I just used the same skills using archaeological and art historical evidence to construct the past. I used that for women in antiquity and for Benjamin Franklin. I mean, because people might say, oh, there isn't much evidence about Benjamin Franklin swimming. How are you going to write this book? But I just used everything I had.
And it's it's wonderful because you, as somebody with the book in front of me here, you're pulling on artwork. You're also pulling on archaeological excavations. I mean, I can really see the way in which that full approach that you've taken in your scholarship carries through.
That's why it's a visual work. It's an illustrated history. And that's new in Franklin studies too, to actually rely on visual evidence. Most historians, they rely on textual evidence, written evidence, but to use visual evidence, you won't find much of that in books on Franklin.
And I also like that you were channeling Franklin. I just want to read from your author's note that you quote Franklin, who published a little statement on literary style on the 2nd of August, 1733, in the Pennsylvania Gazette, where he wrote, "I have thought in general that whoever would write so as not to displease good judges should have particular regard to have these three things: that his performance be smooth, clear, and short." And I think you spoke to maybe this book starting as coming from your last book being more sort of a young adult book. This might be more of an adult book, but I really think that you've really lived up to that triad, and that this is a very smoothly written book. It's a very clear book. It's I mean, your sentences are short, and the book itself is very long, I think, on scholarship. So. Another thing, I guess, to throw in here is that you have maybe an experiential angle to add to this. You say in the book that you're a swimmer. How did you become a swimmer, and what was it like being a swimmer writing a history of another swimmer?
Oh, well, I learned to swim as a child in summer camp, and I've always lived near the water, and I've always loved to swim, and I love to read about swimming. So I have another project in the back of my mind. Like Benjamin Franklin, I play the harpsichord. And I came across a note that Benjamin Franklin played a harpsichord where the sharps and the flats were actually separate notes. And if you can imagine that on a keyboard, well, it'd be hard to imagine because it'd be a huge keyboard, wouldn't it? But I have a harpsichord that has some of those split keys. So the key is half as long, and one half of it is a sharp, and one could be a flat. You can tune them however you like. So I'm kind of interested now in looking into what kind of harpsichord did Benjamin Franklin use, or did he construct it himself? Because it sounds so like it would need so much thought, so much ingenuity to separate the sharps and the flats. Nowadays, in modern tuning, if you tune a piano, you compromise. You know, the A sharp is actually not the same note as B flat, but on the piano, it's one note. It's the same note. It's the same black key. So, but how did that work for Benjamin Franklin to have the actual note separate? So I'd like to look into that, see what kind of harpsichord he had.
That also feels like the type of project that could have both, you know, a sort of an article or a book, but also a performance component to it, which I think, you know, what sort of music.
Find someone to rebuild that, to build what he describes. I'm not sure he describes it. I have to look into this.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great idea. Now I feel like you probably did some of this work during a pandemic. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what was it like researching this project? Did the COVID pandemic affect your ability to pull it together? And how has it been working with the APS on this?
Actually, it being that it was the pandemic, people, I think, were more cooperative and sent me whatever they could. When libraries were closed, if the librarian happened to be home and had that book, that librarian might photograph the pages and send them to me, which would never happen if the actual book was available. And so I had to find most of the images online. All the French museums have digitized all their collections, so that was helpful. But sometimes a digitized image is not as beautiful as one you could get from the museum itself, even so. But I was working with Mary McDonald at the APS, who was the editor for this book. And she said, look, go ahead and publish what you have. This is not an art book. These pictures, these images are being shown to supply evidence for what you're saying, not to be looked at as primarily a work of art. And so I went ahead with it.
Great. So you had mentioned the harpsichord project. Are there any other projects that are sort of in the queue? Or?
Yes, well, I'm the senior editor of probably the largest selling ancient Greek history textbook in the world in English, published by Oxford University Press, and they've just asked us to do a 5th edition. The book is very popular, and there are always new things to say, new archaeological discoveries, new insights, and so I'm working on that too.
Yeah, that feels like a very important project, and one that I think probably helps get your scholarship out to a very broad audience. Well, we have a lot of questions that have rolled in during this talk, and I've been so focused on the questions I had, I should probably turn over to what our audience wants to ask you. The first question says, now water can be very dangerous. And did you find many examples of drowning in your research on 18th century swimming?
Oh, drownings from swimming? No, drownings from because of people not knowing how to swim. And drownings were very popular. I mean, very frequent. You know, Benjamin Franklin was a journalist, but he even stopped recording them unless they were spectacular. You know, unless it was 5 people that went down, like a lighthouse keeper, and then the substitute lighthouse keeper in the next few days, he went down too. And so that was worth writing about. Yes, because so many people were traveling by ship. And they did not know how to swim, and they're afraid of the water. I think this is one of the reasons why his wife never joined him. That's why Deborah never attempted that Atlantic voyage, and they spent so many years of their married life apart.
I think that's one of the really striking things. We have an exhibition that's opening at the end of July on Franklin, the sort of citizen scientist, and Deborah Reed, Franklin's portrait, is hanging in that, which is a wonderful opportunity for people to come and see the original painting. And you know, the museum guides often are asked, you know, why did they live so much of their lives apart? You know, he really spent the better part of the second half of his life in Europe. And as you're saying, that fear of water, right? That fear of, you know, maybe not being able to swim or not feeling comfortable on the water was a big issue. We have another question here that asks, what do you think of Franklin's mode of instructing someone to swim? Should we practice it today? And maybe I'd expand that to some of the strokes that you describe. Have we evolved to a more efficient way of teaching and swimming, or have we lost something?
Well, now more popular is what I would call the Australian crawl.
Okay.
But Franklin didn't do the crawl. That wasn't known, and he doesn't seem to have done the side stroke, which now is passed out of popularity too. The side stroke. He swam on his back, and he did the breaststroke, which is still very popular in London. When I swim at various clubs in London, I see that the British are still doing the breaststroke, which is very tiring. You have to keep your head up.
Yeah. I remember there's a passage in there where he has a way of trying to relieve a leg cramp, which I think, if I remember right, you kind of throw your leg in the air. Has sports medicine maybe evolved in some ways from his time?
I have discussed that with Lynn Shear, who wrote a book called Swim, and she's one of those master swimmers, and she said that would not work. Putting your leg up, that would just give you a worse cramp.
So take some of the Franklin with a grain of salt, I guess. One of our attendees writes, "I'd love the illustrations that I've seen in the presentation. Do you have a favorite image of Franklin?"
Of Franklin himself?
Yes.
Well, I have in the book, I have the portraits of him at various ages.
Yep.
And I selected the ones that I liked. Yes. I liked the one of him that was that I guess it still is at the Metropolitan Museum. And he's wearing his suede jacket, and he looks quite kind of like a frontiersman. And this is how he dresses. He dresses in Paris, where all the men, you know, are wearing perfume and wigs and cod pieces and so on. But he's the rugged American, and he doesn't dress like that. And he's very popular with the ladies.
And I think you made the point too that because he does all this air bathing and swimming, he probably smells a lot better than.
Yes, he didn't have to wear the perfume.
So Dennis McGlade asked, was the Thames River very polluted in the 18th century when he swam in it?
Well, if you read Dickens, yes, they threw corpses in there. But you know, it's a tidal river. It washes in, it washes out, so it cleans itself. Or did it before it was controlled. Now there are embankments. You wouldn't find a sandy shore like you see in the painting that I showed you.
Right. I think sort of building on this, Bill Ward asks, you know, in the 18th and 19th century, there wasn't the sewage treatment that we have today. Did many swimmers of that age get sick from the water, and did they recognize the cause of why they were getting sick if they were?
Well, Franklin didn't get sick from the water. I mean, if you swim properly and you keep your mouth closed, and he's doing the breaststroke, so he's keeping his mouth closed when he goes in. I don't see why he would. Maybe he could have gotten some skin problems, but He had them and he had skin problems anyway. I think the being clean was more important.
The maybe also what you mentioned about the tidalness of some of the places would have had a more salutary effect in sort of pulling contaminants further out. Another question here picked up on the question I asked you about being a swimmer. And our attendee wants to know, do you swim in the open water like Franklin did? Is it more or less easy to do today than in the 18th century? So are you a pool swimmer or are you a river swimmer? Or...
Well, I swim wherever I am. But right now I have a pool here in Sag Harbor, so I swim in that. That's very convenient for me. But there is a bay, walking distance. I can go in that. That's but when I go to the ocean here in the Hamptons, sometimes the water is very rough and there are rip tides and the lifeguards have the red flags up. So that can be disappointing. You get yourself psyched up to swim and then you get to the ocean and it's not swimmable.
Yeah. Where I grew up south of Boston, there was a shark warning, which was not for people who grew up watching Jaws was not welcome. Judy Himes, a good friend of the APS, asks, can you say a little bit more about the invention of swimwear? When did people stop swimming naked? And is it an American invention or an English invention, or do we know?
The first women who were famous for swimming wore these woolen bathing suits, and that was certainly not an advantage because we know that wool gets wet and it gets soggy, but there was no other way that a modest woman could get in the water. So that was 20th century.
20th century, right.
Yeah.
And so, I think you touched on this very in the start of the talk. So swimming is really a gendered activity in the 18th century, right? That it's mostly men who are doing it because modesty might have kept women or societal constraints might have kept women from swimming.
Definitely, yes. It was men who and Benjamin Franklin was actually very supportive of women's education, but he excludes women from the swimming part of the curriculum, I think because he knew that they wouldn't, it was just unthinkable.
Right.
But he seems to not have much modesty. He takes off his clothes, he jumps in the river.
Even at, what do you say, at 80 years old, what was his nickname? Old Fat Sides at one point he called himself, like,
but he swam early in the morning. Very early in the morning, so probably the French people weren't they weren't up to see it.
So Nils von Emmers asks, did you know that Benjamin Franklin is in the International Swimmers Hall of Fame?
Oh yes, I have that in the book, in the epilogue. He was elected, I think, in the 1960s, but for his inventions, the paddles and the surfing with the kite, but mostly for his role in promoting swimming education.
That goes back to your argument about him as a sort of evangelist that's really popularizing this. All right, I'm just scrolling through these questions. One question I think we've probably already touched on, but did Franklin contract any diseases or infections from swimming in those rivers? I think you had mentioned he sometimes had some skin conditions, but we don't know if those are connected to the water, right? Somebody wants to know, have you ever visited the International Swimming Hall of Fame in Fort Lauderdale?
In Fort Lauderdale, I know there's one in Philadelphia. In Fort Lauderdale, well, maybe that's the local Swimming Hall of Fame. No, maybe I should like to go. Yes.
Sounds like a field trip. That sounds great. Another question here that's just come in. Did Franklin's interest in swimming inspire his research on the water more generally? Perhaps his interest in the Gulf Stream? Yes,
I think that you've hit upon something, whoever sent in that question. Yes, he felt that the water was warm, and then he discovered the Gulf Stream. that because he was swimming off boats when he was voyaging back and forth across the Atlantic, he discovered the Gulf Stream. He had lengthy correspondence about swimming, about water, about the buoyancy of water.
That's great. So I have a sort of comment here from Elizabeth Laurent, who writes that she'd like to bring to everyone's attention an exhibition opening on September 3rd at the Fairmount Waterworks Historic Kelly Natatorium named Pool, a social history of segregated history in Philadelphia. So Pool, a social history of segregated history in Philadelphia.
Where is that opening? Where?
It's going to open on September 3rd at the Fairmount Waterworks here, right on the banks of the Schuylkill, about 1.5 miles from the APS. She writes, it's both a great chance to experience the amazing waterworks that, of course, have survived and been restored, and learn a more modern chapter of swimming in the city of Philadelphia.
Oh, very interesting.
That's great. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, so much for bringing that to our attention. And maybe we can send around a link to that after the talk. All right, so we had mentioned that Franklin was self-taught, but do you have a sense maybe of whether any of his family members knew how to swim? I don't know if there was ever any references that you saw in the letters to learning that his parents were swimming or that his brothers or sisters were swimming.
Well, he swam with a gang of boys in Boston.
Okay.
He came from a family that with his father had at least two wives and 17 children. So I imagine if he was swimming, that some of the other boys were swimming. Yeah, but the one we know about, of course, is his grandson, Benny Beish, because he enjoyed swimming.
I think with this very firm history of swimming that we need to petition the APS to found a pool now. I think that would be a wonderful benefit for the members of the society and the staff here. So
yes, it would be very good part of the meetings.
Well, thank you so much for giving us your time today. This has been a fantastic conversation. This is, of course, our last talk of the spring programming season as well. So it's a wonderful one to go out on. I hope everyone will go to the APS site, go to Amazon.com, order their copy. If you order your copy through the APS, you get a 21% discount. I don't know what the discount is over at Amazon. So thank you, Sarah, so much for sharing this book with us, sharing your knowledge with us. And I hope you will keep us in mind if you want to do something on that harpsichord idea. We love Franklin here.
Goodbye.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone.